Awesome.
Hi, everybody. I'd like to thank you guys for coming tonight. For those of you guys who don't know me, I'm Mel. I'm the secretary of NCHS. Just want to let you guys know, we do have Terry and Kayla in the back there selling raffle tickets for our raffle items, and it's a first come, first serve raffle. So when your name or your number's called, you can run up and grab any item that you want over there. How did everybody learn about the meetings? Did you guys hear about it online?
Facebook.
Friend? Facebook? Cool. Yeah, awesome. So if you guys are not members and you wish to be a member, Terry back there can help you with signing up for a membership. And you guys get a couple of perks with that. You get, I think it's 10% off GX3. And you guys got our monthly newsletter that Kayla puts out. She does an awesome job of that. I don't know if you guys know that NCHS was established in 1982. And it's a volunteer organization. We all do this because we love the animals. And our rescue and adoption programs helped hundreds of animals. So we really appreciate you guys coming and supporting us. Okay, so we have several board members here tonight. We have Lisa Farina who's here, and she's going to be giving you guys a nice introduction for Roy.
Hi everybody, thanks again for coming. Really excited. A little spiel about Roy. He's been keeping reptiles since his childhood, but it's probably been the last 5 or so years that he's been making a big impact in the herpetoculture community. Roy keeps obscure, often overlooked reptiles, and let alone he breeds them. You know, they're rarely kept and he breeds them successfully. But it's not Roy's success in breeding that's most inspiring. It's the way that Roy chooses to keep his animals and the things he's able to see because of the way he keeps them. Roy has had a big impact on my keeping. And beyond just being a keeper, Roy is also a host of a wonderful podcast with his partner, Phil Leeds, Project Herpetoculture. On that podcast, they ponder the meaning of herpetoculture, often showing that herpetoculture can be an art form, it can be a discipline, it can be meditative, it can be a form of therapy. It can quite possibly be something that we've inherited in our DNA, passed down from our ancestors, and hopefully it can be something to make friends and build a community around. If this is your first introduction to Roy, you're in for a treat. So without further ado, thank you for being here, Roy.
Thanks. How do I get set up really quick? I don't really know. This is my first PowerPoint that I've ever done. So hopefully this works well. Just put it in there. How's everybody doing?
Good.
Good. Just leave it open a little crack. I'll just leave. Oh, I thought you were going to the door.
No,
Okay, yeah.
Someone's escaping already. Okay.
Thank you.
So, how do we turn this thing on? That button?
It is starting, yeah. The button up here. I think it's turning on. It's flicking.
Okay.
Yeah, that's.
jumping there.
It's waking up.
There it is. There it is.
How do we dim the lights?
Back out.
Too dark? Too dark. Let's see. Like, either all or nothing.
This is one of the species of lizards that I work with at home. This is a Polycris marmoratus, which is the common monkey lizard. Sometimes people call them monkey anoles. And it's one of my favorite species, and this is my desktop background. And here we go, okay.
Which is better? This or that?
That's better.
That's better, yeah.
Cool. All right, so yeah, the presentation I put together is about naturalistic herpetoculture, and I feel like just right off the bat, I'm not even sure that that's the best term for what I do, but I think it's a term that works, and I think that it can be a little bit complicated because naturalistic is like a pretty loaded term. Or natural is a pretty loaded term, and what we perceive as natural can be different to different people, and so that's something that I'll be kind of exploring and referencing a lot as I go through the talk. But to start out, I wanted to kind of offer what my interpretation of naturalistic herpetoculture. What do I think that is? And so I said it is a style of keeping that prioritizes the provision of stimuli which encourage a broad range of natural behaviors in herpetofauna. So it's about providing our animals opportunities to express what they do. You know, reptiles have been, you know, undergoing pressures of evolution for millions of years, and there's all kinds of information just locked within their biology that never will emerge unless it has the right opportunity, the right incentive, the right stimulus to emerge. And for me, in keeping reptiles, when I get to see like novel behaviors come out and see those behaviors emerge, that is what is most rewarding for me as a keeper. And so that's that's what I've been working toward, and so naturalistic herpetoculture will often include these elements. So I've put in overhead heating and broad spectrum lighting, loose substrate suitable for burrowing or foraging behavior, replication of the climatic and seasonal variation that the species would experience in their native range, spacious habitat with furnishings and orientation to maximize the space that's there available to the animal, and then the provision of an appropriate diet which is species appropriate. So in some species, we experience some issues in herpetoculture with an animal that's fed only rodents when, in their native range they would never do that, and that can sometimes have impacts like shortening their lifespans. And so this is kind of like, in some ways, aspirational. Like it's challenging to perfectly approximate all of these things in a captive environment a lot of the time. And but this is kind of like what I'm aspiring to provide for the animals in my care. And like I said, also like this often includes the following, because there's a range of what can be included within the definition of naturalistic herpetoculture. So along those lines, one thing I wanted to speak to is that what's really important in the whole conversation around naturalistic herpetoculture is that we're striving to replicate processes more than necessarily a certain look. And so a lot of the time, when the term naturalistic herpetoculture is brought up, or just naturalistic reptile keeping is brought up, the image that comes to mind is like, a planted vivarium and or the dart frog kind of style of keeping. And that though that is or can be a form of naturalistic herpetoculture, I would consider this setup, which was put together by my friend Phil Leeds for his Uromastics, an excellent example of naturalistic herpetoculture. Because although the aesthetic isn't like the most natural thing, you know, he has roof tiles and pavers and stuff like that in there. What he's achieving in terms of the processes that he's allowing for in his animals is optimal. And so, yeah, that's something I wanted to bring about. And that said, in my setups, I really like them to look pretty and look like I like to think that I'm sculpting like a little slice of their native habitat. That's what I'm striving to do. And so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is how I go about doing that and what it elicits in my animals when I do it. So, how do we go about it? Yeah, a lot of this has to do with like really learning about your animal, learning about the species that you're keeping, and learning about its natural history and ecology, the way that it interacts with its environment. And so some of the resources that I really like to use are Google Scholar, iNaturalist, and WeatherSpark. So those are the three that I'm going to talk about today, how I use them. Google Scholar is basically just a search engine that you can use to find like research articles, scientific papers, and it's really awesome because like you can kind of, like if you just go through your standard Google engine, you're going to get all kinds of stuff, but this is a little bit more focused. And so like in this example, I just typed in Spilotes sulphureus. However, I note that like it's good to also see if the species that you're working with had other scientific names that were used for it in the past, and to check those as well in the search engine, because sometimes the papers are old and they might have really helpful, relevant information, but it's just under a different name. So in the example of Spilotes, those snakes for a really long time were called Sustes sulphureus, and so it would be really helpful to look up both of those names. And yeah, like another thing I like to do is I'll type in like certain keywords like diet or natural history or ecology following like the scientific name, and that'll help focus the results a little bit. So because sometimes you'll get these papers that are just like impenetrable scientific jargon and it has no relevance to herpetoculture, but sometimes, like if you're looking for things about like what does this animal eat, where it's from, or like what is its natural history, what is its ecology, typing in those search terms can help you find it. So the next thing I really like to use a lot is, this is probably my favorite resource honestly for what I do with keeping my reptiles, and that's iNaturalist. And iNaturalist is like a really awesome online platform for citizen science where individuals can post observations of anything, like a plant, mushroom, reptile, anything, and to be the aggregate of like thousands and thousands of posts from people from all over posting these things, you can sometimes do some really interesting information. And so one thing I like to do is you can create a profile on iNaturalist, like any site, and then but you can actually subscribe to the species or the taxa that you're currently keeping. So that's one thing I like to do when I start working with a species. I'll go onto iNaturalist and I'll actually subscribe to that species. And that way, like, I'll have it on my dashboard essentially whenever I log in there, any new observations that have come up. But one thing I like to do is go and, like, when I'm first researching something, I'll go to iNaturalist and I'll select the grid view. You can see the little indicator thing over here. It says map, grid, and lists. I'll take the grid view, and that can give you it'll just give you a bunch of pictures basically. And sometimes that can actually give you a really good idea of like what does it look like where your animal is from, and you can kind of just deduce a lot about how to set them up from that information. And then you can also go through and you can kind of like look for like novel interactions. Like sometimes you'll see really cool things like in the Spilotes on iNaturalist, someone posted an example of male combat between Spilotes sulphureus, which up to that point was not something that was published anywhere about that species, but then suddenly someone had taken a bunch of pictures of these male spilotes fighting, and there it was. So, but you can also find other really relevant information. So like this is an example of, again, the common monkey lizard, which was my desktop background animal, and this is just kind of like one of those things that I was like scrolling through iNaturalist, and I noticed this, and there are several observations of these monkey lizards with huge insects in their mouths. Like you can see the size of this katydid that this monkey lizard is eating is much larger than the kind of standard cricket or something like that you would expect to be feeding this thing. And so I noticed that, and I was like, huh, that's kind of interesting. And I'll speak a little bit more to that later. One thing that I like to do also is I like to put together plant lists for the species that I keep, and actually I like to try and plant the vivariums that I'm putting together with plants that are also found where that species is from in the wild. And iNaturalist is actually a really great resource to find plants that are, you know, sharing the range of the reptile that you're keeping. So you can actually go and you can search by location, as you can see up there. And then what I'll do is I'll type in like a plant family. Like in this case, I typed in aeroids, which a lot of like our common houseplants, you know, that you can get at Home Depot and stuff like that, are in the aeroid family. And so that will just give you a list of all kinds of species to look for. And a lot of times, if you're like trying to find them, you just Google them. And someone on Etsy is selling that plant for $5, and you can get it for your snake's vivarium. Another cool thing that you can find on iNaturalist is they have this like little graph on like the page for every species of the seasonality of the observations that people make. And sometimes that can be really telling about like how that animal is living like through the seasons. And so for this example, I have the banded hognose snake. This is another species I keep. Most of the time they're called tricolor hognose snakes in herpetoculture. But you can see, so this is like the year and the seasonality of observations. You can really see how there's this huge peak in the spring and in the fall, big dip in activity in the summer. And of course that lines up perfectly with like their breeding seasons, and also like the peak season of rainfall when there's like a lot of amphibians. These snakes in the wild almost exclusively eat amphibians. And yeah, that kind of information is just really helpful for figuring out like, okay, when should I be like really giving them a lot of food if I want to encourage breeding? When should I be cooling them down for you know, brumation, that kind of thing? This is kind of a funny one, but because tricolor hognose snakes are fossorial, which, you know, that means they burrow essentially 80% of the time. They're under their substrate. They do come out and bask and climb around, but a lot of the time they're going to be burrowed. I was always curious, like, okay, well, what is the substrate, the soil like where they live? And one thing I noticed on iNaturalist, if you go again through that grid view, they're on sand. It's like this sandy loam essentially where they live. And so this is an observation, you know, this tricolored burrowing in this kind of loose, crumbly sand. So now we're going to talk about weather spark a little bit, and then we'll get into the kind of more fun stuff of my lecture. But weather sparks basically just got a ton of information on climate data and temperatures for different locations. You can basically type in like anywhere in the world, and you'll get a bunch of data immediately. And with all these like graphs, which for me is really helpful. I'm like a pretty visual learner, so having graphs is really helpful for me to kind of visualize things. In this case, I typed in Braunschweig, Suriname, which is an area that is not far from where some of my reptiles are in their native range. And so this graph depicts the average high and low temperature in that region. And you can see it's pretty much a straight line. Like, we're right on the equator there, so that can tell you right away, like, there's not, like, if you're trying to cycle these animals for breeding and stuff like that, temperature is not necessarily the way that you're going to be doing it. However, like, alternatively, if you look at like the rainfall cycle, there's like significant variation throughout the year in that same region. And again, like, you can kind of take this information and then extrapolate it to your keeping. So one of the ways that I've been able to encourage some of the species I have from this region to breed with more consistency is to like schedule my mist king system with this kind of gradual rise and fall. So I'll basically increase the misting schedule a lot for a 3-month period and then drop it and decrease it a lot for a 3-month period and then alternate that. And that kind of helps to mimic, again, this cycle of the rainfall in Suriname. Another thing I like to do with the species where it's more relevant, like again with the equatorial species, it's basically 12 hours of daylight, 12 hours of night year round. But this is actually Cordoba, Argentina, and that's the area where those tricolor hognose snakes are found. And you can see there's a lot more variation. It's actually very similar to our night and day cycle here, where we are, similar latitude. And so I'll time my lights on timers to match that as well as I can. So I'll adjust them like every few weeks or so throughout the year in like 15 or 20 minute increments just to try and match that cycle. And I've noticed it has like pretty significant impacts on the behavior of the animals to do that. So some of you might be like hearing about all that and thinking to yourself like, why would you do that? That sounds like a lot of effort and a lot of work to go to just for keeping reptiles when you could keep them potentially in much more simple ways, and that's true. But again, like for me, as I said earlier, a lot of what is rewarding to me about herpetoculture is observing my animals and observing their behaviors. And so giving them a lot of like change and variation and consistency within the tolerances that they would expect in their native ranges is just really rewarding. So yeah, I want to kind of go into some examples of like some of like the rewarding kind of rich behavior I've observed as a result of all this. And this is kind of a fun example. Lisa's familiar with this one, but so this is one of the main species I have been working with for the last several years. This is a species that, it's actually the first species of snake I ever hatched. I got really lucky, and when I was 16 years old, I bought an Amazon puffing snake, or a pair of Amazon puffing snakes. At that time, they were super rare snakes. Only a few people in the country really had them. And the female that I bought was a wild-caught import from Suriname, and she laid a clutch of eggs about 2 weeks after I got her. And I was like living in a trailer park in Santa Rosa, this little kid with no money whatsoever, and I got like a chicken incubator with my like all the money I could scrape together, and managed to get these eggs to hatch after 97 days of incubating. And pretty soon after that, I actually got out of herpetoculture for about 10 years, but when I got back into it, Amazon puffing snakes were like the species I wanted to keep. So when I got back in, I immediately set them up in a kind of naturalistic vivarium. There were live plants in the setup, but at a certain point I was like, okay, I want to get really nerdy, and I want to get like only live plants from where they're from. And so I started doing all kinds of research, and I found this one bromeliad, Echmea nudicalis is the scientific name, that is found in that same region, and I bought a bunch of them, and I set them up in the vivarium. And at this point I had 2 wild-caught adult female sulphureus and 1 male who was actually one of the snakes I had hatched when I was 16 years old. I got to essentially buy him back. And as soon as I put these bromeliads in, the 2 wild-caught females immediately started going and drinking out of them. And I realized like, oh, this is like, you guys know what you're doing here. Like, this is something that you use. My interpretation is that these snakes very likely were familiar with bromeliads from living out in the wild in Suriname, and knew very well that they could find water in them. One thing that's unique about bromeliads, you can kind of see the structure of the plant. It has this interior cavity there called the axil that is meant to store water, just to hold water. And all kinds of animals utilize that. You know, like dart frogs will lay their eggs in there, rear their tadpoles in bromeliads. But this was the first time I observed, like, wow, like snakes will drink out of bromeliads. And then I was all excited about this observation and really lit up about it. And then a couple years later, this popped up on iNaturalist. And this was after I had already seen this in my vivarium. And you know, if I had seen this before, you know, putting the bromeliads in there, I would have had no idea what this was going on here. I would be like, oh, maybe the snake's like looking for frogs, or maybe it's doing something, and it's foraging for something. But this is an example of a wild Amazon puffy snake drinking from a bromeliad. This is another fun one. So these are the monkey lizards, again, the Polychrus marmoratus, and I did the same thing with them, found a bunch of species from that same region, planted the vivarium with it. And one of them was this aeroid species called Anthurium gracile. And that plant would create this beautiful inflorescence of bright red berries. And I kept noticing that, like, it would do that, and then after a couple of days, all the berries would disappear. And I was kind of like, okay, like, and I kind of was like, maybe the lizards are eating the berries, but I was also like, well, maybe it's the isopods, or maybe it's like the crickets and the roaches that have escaped. Like, I don't actually know if it's the lizards. And then eventually, I walked in one day and saw this, and I was like, okay, so that's kind of fun. So this is Dolly. She's one of my adult females. She's named after Dolly Parton. And she's amazing. And here she is enjoying some berries.
Hey.
That's a Lucinda over there on the left, who's named after Lucinda Williams, watching, quite irritated that Dolly's not interested in sharing. So, yeah, that's just like another one of those things where it's just how cool is that to be growing plants, you know, in the vivarium that the lizards are then eating. So earlier I mentioned that observation of seeing these monkey lizards eating huge insects, and you know, that totally like makes sense. If you think about the ecology of these lizards, these are really weird lizards. They're in a family of their own. Called the Polycrotidae, and for a long time they were considered to be relatives of anoles, but after like more recent genetic analysis was happening, they found that actually they're completely isolated. They're on their own. They're not really closely related to anything else, and they're only found in Central and South America. And I think of them in a lot of ways as like the New World's equivalent of a chameleon. They have a lot of similar life strategies to chameleons. They change color. They tend to be passive in their feeding strategies. So instead of like actively foraging and going around looking for food like a tegu or a monitor would, most of the time these guys are just hanging out on a branch and waiting for something to walk by. And I've always noticed this correlation for lizards, especially that employ a passive feeding strategy, is that they can eat very large meals, because though they're not eating as often, they need to make it count when they eat. And so they often specialize in eating really large insects. And this is an example of a mantid that I offered to this female Polychrus. This is the first time I offered one. And it was amazing because she like sprang to life in a way that I'd never seen before. And she, again, this was a wild caught lizard. And she immediately kind of like started angling in a certain way to try and strike on this mantid, and the way that she ended up eventually biting the mantid and killing it was actually, she grabbed it in such a way that the mantid's raptorial forelegs, its defense mechanism was immobilized, so it couldn't fight back. And it was like very clear that she knew what she was doing. And because mantids are kind of a hard thing to come by as a feeder, I ended up finding phasmids, stick insects, which are very easy to breed with just blackberry bramble. Sometimes, you know, you'll see them in like high school classrooms. The science teacher will have a phasmid colony, and so they love phasmids.